The room went silent the second my mother smiled and said, "Honestly, Ethan never even played that old thing anymore." I stared at the empty corner of my son's music room. The piano was gone. Not covered, not moved, gone. My 8-year-old son stood beside me clutching a sheet of practice music against his chest. His small face looked confused more than upset, like he still believed adults always had a reasonable explanation for everything. "Where's Grandpa's piano?" he asked quietly. My father waved a dismissive hand while sitting at the kitchen table. "We sold it, just like that. No discussion, no permission, no apology." The antique baby grand piano my grandfather had protected for over 40 years had disappeared while Ethan and I were away for the weekend. I felt my stomach tighten. "That piano belonged to Ethan," I said calmly. My mother laughed under her breath. "Please, it was collecting dust. It was not yours to sell." Dad leaned back in his chair, like I was being dramatic. "You should actually thank us. We solved one of your problems." "What problem?" "The fact that you can barely keep up with bills while raising a kid alone." There it was. Not concern, not help, judgment. They had always talked to me like I was one mistake away from failure ever since my divorce. Meanwhile, my younger brother could burn money in casinos and still be called ambitious. But me, I worked 2 jobs, raised my son, paid every bill on time, and somehow I was still treated like the irresponsible child. Ethan looked at me carefully. He knew that expression on my face. The quiet one. "Where did it go?" I asked. Dad shrugged. "Private collector." "For how much?" Mom and Dad exchanged a quick look. That was enough. "How much?" $97,000. My mother finally admitted. For a second, even the air felt heavy. My son's fingers tightened around the music sheets. They had sold the one thing Grandpa treasured most. The same piano he used to play every Christmas. The same piano he taught Ethan to play on after his arthritis got too painful for long performances. And they sold it behind our backs, like it was an old chair in storage. "You had no right," I said quietly. Dad scoffed. "Oh, stop acting sentimental. Your grandfather is in a retirement home now. He barely remembers what day it is." That sentence hit harder than I expected, because it was a lie. Grandpa remembered everything, especially that piano, every scratch on it, every concert attached to it, every story hidden inside its faded wood. My mother crossed her arms. "And before you start threatening lawyers, remember something? We already used some of the money." Of course they had. I nodded slowly. No yelling, no scene, no emotional breakdown. That almost seemed to disappoint them. "You're not angry?" my father asked. I looked at Ethan first. He was trying not to cry. That mattered more than anything else. So I knelt beside him and adjusted the collar of his sweater. "Go pack your backpack, buddy." "But the piano." "I know." He hesitated before quietly walking upstairs. The second he disappeared, my mother exhaled dramatically. "Thank God. I thought you were going to make this into some huge family war." I looked directly at her. "No," I said calmly. "I don't think I need to." Dad frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" I picked up my car keys from the counter. "You sold something that never belonged to you," I said. "Now we'll see what Grandpa thinks about that." For the first time, neither of them spoke, because deep down, they already knew something important. Grandpa may have been old, but he was still the one person in this family nobody could control. And they had absolutely no idea what he was about to do next. The drive to Grandpa's retirement home was quiet. Ethan sat beside me staring out the window, still holding the music sheets like they were part of the piano itself. I kept replaying my parents' words in my head, especially the part where they said Grandpa barely remembered anything. The moment we entered his room, Grandpa looked up from his chair and smiled at Ethan. "You practiced the second movement, yet." Ethan's eyes immediately filled with tears. That was all Grandpa needed to understand something was wrong. I explained everything calmly. No exaggeration, no anger, just facts. The smile slowly disappeared from Grandpa's face. "They sold it?" he asked quietly. I nodded. For nearly 10 seconds, he said nothing. He simply looked toward the window with the kind of silence that felt heavier than shouting. Then he reached for the old leather folder beside his chair. "Call your father," he said. When Dad answered on speaker, his confident tone disappeared the second Grandpa spoke. "That piano was never legally yours to touch," Grandpa said calmly, "and neither is the property attached to my will anymore." Silence. Then Grandpa revealed something none of us expected. 3 years earlier, he had transferred ownership of the antique piano and several family assets into Ethan's name through a protected trust. Dad suddenly sounded nervous. "Wait, what?" "You sold a child's property," Grandpa replied. "That makes this very serious." For the first time in years, I heard fear in my father's voice. Meanwhile, Grandpa simply adjusted his blanket and looked at Ethan gently. Some people only understand value after they lose respect. That night my parents kept calling me, but I never answered once. And if you enjoy calm revenge stories where silence becomes power, subscribe to Justice Tales Junction. Some lessons hit harder when the quiet person finally stops being underestimated, because while they were busy spending money that never belonged to them, Grandpa had already made his move. 2 days later, my parents arrived at Grandpa's retirement home without warning. For the first time in years, they looked nervous instead of confident. Dad carried a folder under his arm. Mom held a forced smile that disappeared the second Grandpa refused to look at her. "We came to fix this misunderstanding," Dad said carefully. Grandpa remained calm. "A misunderstanding is forgetting someone's birthday. Selling your grandson's property for $97,000 is called something else." Neither of them answered. Ethan sat beside Grandpa, quietly practicing finger patterns on the armrest of his chair. Watching him somehow made the silence even heavier. Dad cleared his throat. "We already contacted the buyer. We can probably get the piano back." "Probably?" Grandpa asked. Mom stepped forward quickly. "We didn't think this would become such a huge issue." That sentence almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it revealed everything. They never felt guilty about stealing it. They only panicked after realizing there would be consequences. Grandpa slowly folded his hands together. "Do you know why that piano mattered to me?" Nobody spoke. "Because your grandmother bought it after my first sold-out performance," he continued softly. "We were poor. She spent nearly all our savings believing in me before anyone else did." Even Dad lowered his eyes. And when Ethan started learning music, Grandpa said, looking at my son proudly, "I finally knew exactly who deserved it next." The room stayed silent. No dramatic speeches. No shouting. Just truth finally standing where excuses used to be. Dad eventually slid the folder across the table toward me. "We'll return every dollar." I didn't touch it. Grandpa looked at me instead. "That decision is yours." For a moment, I thought about every holiday where I'd been treated like the failure of the family. Every insult disguised as advice. Every time they confused kindness with weakness. Then I looked at Ethan, and suddenly the answer became simple. "I don't want revenge," I said calmly. "I want distance." Mom's face fell instantly. "You can't be serious." "I am." Dad tried one last time. "We're family." I nodded slowly. Family doesn't steal from a child. Nobody had a response to that. A week later, the piano returned home. But something else never returned with it: my parents' control over my life. And as Grandpa listened to Ethan play that old piano again, he smiled quietly and said, "People mistake silence for weakness because they've never learned what real strength sounds like." A month after the piano returned, life became strangely peaceful. My parents stopped calling every day. The constant criticism disappeared. No more passive-aggressive comments about my job, my divorce, or how I raised Ethan. For years, I had mistaken their control for family involvement. Distance finally showed me the difference. One evening, I walked into the living room and found Ethan playing Grandpa's favorite song on the restored piano. The late sunlight hit the faded wood softly, and for a moment, the entire house felt calm again. Grandpa sat nearby with his eyes closed, listening quietly, not speaking, not correcting, just listening. And somehow that silence taught me more than all the arguments I had survived. Because real strength rarely arrives loudly. The people who constantly demand attention, respect, and control usually depend on noise to feel powerful. They interrupt, mock, criticize, and manipulate because silence makes them uncomfortable. Silence forces truth to breathe. That was the biggest lesson my parents never understood. They thought power meant making decisions for everyone else. They thought money gave them authority. They thought being older automatically made them right. But respect built through fear disappears the second consequences arrive. Grandpa never raised his voice once during the entire situation. He never insulted them back. He never begged for understanding. Yet somehow he became the strongest person in every room simply because he stood calmly beside the truth. And that changed something inside me. I realized I had spent years trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided not to see it. No achievement would ever be enough for someone committed to misunderstanding you. So I stopped explaining myself, stopped defending every decision, stopped shrinking just to keep others comfortable. Because peace begins the moment you stop asking difficult people for permission to respect yourself. My parents eventually apologized again, but by then something important had already changed. I forgave them quietly, yet I no longer needed their approval to feel complete. And maybe that is the hardest truth for controlling people to accept. The quiet person they underestimated eventually learns how to live happily without them controlling the story anymore. As Ethan finished the final notes of the song, Grandpa smiled proudly and whispered, "Some families pass down money, others pass down wisdom. Make sure you know which one truly matters."